We are extremely honored to have as our guest today David Miliband. David is the president and CEO of the International Rescue Committee, where he oversees both the agency's humanitarian relief operations and its refugee resettlement and assistance programs in several American cities. Today, he will be discussing one of the most divisive issues of our day, refugees. This topic is also the subject of his recently published book entitled Rescue, Refugees and the Political Crisis of Our Time.
I want to first of all say thanks to you, Joanne, and to the Council for letting me come today, because one of the purposes of writing this book was to take the refugee crisis out of a self-selected world of humanitarian experts and countries that are dealing with refugees and occasionally the front page, and bring it into wider conversation. Because one of my diagnoses of this crisis is that the world's refugees are a victim of a complacency that somehow law and practice had been established after the Second World War to protect refugees, and they were properly looked after. They were almost put into another part of the mind. And one reason for writing the book was to be able to come and have breakfasts like this, to talk about the nature of the modern refugee crisis, which in some ways bears hallmarks of previous refugee crises, but has also got distinctive characteristics. And to try and engage people who had a wider interest to see that this issue of global displacement, of people forced from their homes by conflict and persecution, is deeply connected to the fate of the global system overall. And so the fact that here the Council is interested in, yes, values and ethics and norms, but is also interested in international affairs, is exactly the nexus that I try to discuss in the book. And I thought I'd just talk about four things, really. First of all, what is the refugee crisis today? Secondly, why should we care? Thirdly, what can be done about it? And fourthly, what do we all have to do about it? Just let me start with the bare facts. 65 million people displaced from their homes by conflict or persecution in the world today. Not economic migrants, people who are choosing to leave their home and their country in order to seek economic betterment. There are about 250 million of those. These 65 million people are homeless because of war or persecution. Of that 65 million, 40 million are still within their own home country. So they're what's called internally displaced. So 7 million Syrians have been bombed or driven out of their homes, but they're still living within Syria. In northeast Nigeria, 2 million people have been displaced from their homes by the Boko Haram terrorist group, but they're still within Nigeria. So 40 million internally displaced. About 25 million are refugees. I mean, absolutely technically, 22.5 million are refugees and 3 million are asylum seekers. But just keep in your head that 25 million people of the 65 million are people who have been driven from their homes by conflict or persecution, and they've gone into a neighboring country. And the definition of a refugee is someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution. In other words, they don't feel safe to go home, and they're judged not to be safe to go home. One danger of this crisis, and one idea behind the book, is that 65 million feels like a dehumanized number. It's almost so big that it can't be comprehended. It's actually 1 in every 110 people on the planet. So it's a population. It would be the 21st largest country in the world if it was a country. There are characteristics of these people, though, that I think are important to understand. One is that half of these people are under the age of 18. So half of the world's refugees are children. We'll come back to what that means for some of the argument about refugee resettlement, because if you think about the debate about Syrian refugees arriving in the US, fully 47% of the Syrians who've been allowed to come to the US are actually kids. But one characteristic is that they're children. A second characteristic that's very important about the displaced population is that they're displaced for a long time. I mean, many of us, my own family, there'll be other people in this room who have family heritage of displacement during the Second World War, and the displacement was for a limited period of time. Those who survived. My mother was a refugee from Poland in 1945. My dad was a refugee from Belgium in 1940 to the UK. Today, the average length of displacement is 10 years. And once you've been a refugee for 5 years, the average goes up to 21 years. So essentially, we're talking about not just a large scale of displacement, 65 million people, 25 million refugees, we're also talking about long-term displacement. Third characteristic that I think is incredibly important, half for kids, 10-year average displacement. 60% of refugees live in urban areas, not in camps. The challenge for them is different than in a camp setting. In a camp, you're pretty much guaranteed food, and if you're really sick, you'll get some health care. In an urban setting, you're not guaranteed that kind of food delivery or the health delivery either. So we've got an urbanized displaced population, as well as a young displaced population, as well as a long-term displaced population. And obviously, there's a whole different book to be written about why should this be happening now? Why should there be a refugee crisis today? Maybe we'll come back to this in the questions, but I just want you to have in your mind that there are about 20 to 25 weak states around the world who don't have the political systems that can contain religious and ethnic and political difference. The most recently in the news is obviously Myanmar. 800,000 people driven out of the country in the space of 9 weeks. And the political system didn't give them citizenship rights, didn't recognize them properly, actually immiserated and impoverished them, never mind torched their villages. So you've got 20 to 25 weak states around the world that can't share power, that aren't able to share power effectively. Secondly, a weak and divided international political system. So this is your international affairs part of the story and speaks to my own background. I was foreign minister in the UK for 3 years. The international political system is weaker and more divided certainly than any time since the end of the Cold War, but in some ways it's weaker than any time since World War II. And thirdly, and very difficult to talk about, but dishonest to not to mention, the IRC was founded by Albert Einstein to rescue Jews from Europe. Today, about 45% of our beneficiaries are Muslim. Large part of the refugee crisis is located in Muslim-majority countries. Syria, Afghanistan, two prime examples. And the tumult that exists within the Islamic world is a part of the refugee crisis that exists today. It's not only, South Sudan has 1 million refugees in Uganda, it's nothing to do with Islam. But the fact that there is this electric, explosive debate within the Islamic world that in my description here pits pluralism against purification, and essentially radical Salafism is an attempt to purify the Islamic world. It's a debate within Islam. That is producing these large numbers of people to that degree of tumult is producing the refugee crisis. None of those are short-term trends. Weak states, divided international system, huge debate within the Islamic world about its future and how it engages with the rest of the world. Those are long-term trends, not blips. And so what we're dealing with, I argue in the book, is something that's going to basically go on for the rest of my days. It's a long-term crisis, not something that's going to go away. So the second question then becomes, why should we care? And there's an obvious reason we should care, which is that I was brought up to believe that if there's someone in need and you're able to help them and you don't, that's not just a waste, it's a crime. And so there's a moral core to this that I don't think we should be ashamed of. We actually now no longer have the excuse that the Rohingya crisis is something we don't know about. Even in the 1990s, people said about the debate in the former Yugoslavia, oh, I'm not sure what's really happening, I don't know. Even in 25 years, certainly if you think back to some of the refugee crises in the 70s, ignorance was used as an excuse, never mind in the 40s or 30s. But today we don't have the excuse of ignorance. We actually know the circumstances of people in Juba, South Sudan, in Aleppo, Syria, in Rakhine State. And it's a choice about whether or not we, as part of the richer Western world, decide to do anything. First of all, I don't think we should shy away from the fact that it's a moral choice. People often say to me, yeah, but we've got our own problems at home. Charity begins at home. And my point to them is, yeah, but charity doesn't end at home. And that's the central moral choice that I think we've got to address, and it's put into stark relief when you learn that a country like Uganda, where the average income is $962 per year, per person, has taken 1 million refugees over the last year. And when I went to Uganda in June, I went to South Sudan to see our nutrition programs and then to Uganda to see the way they were handling the refugees. I met this deputy chairman of the local council in northern Uganda, which is receiving all these refugees. So he's an elected politician. And I said to him, what do you think about this refugee crisis then? It's, how are you going to deal with it? He says, well, I'll tell you one thing. I know this is not a political event, but he said, I'll tell you one thing, I'm not building a wall. And this is the age of globalization. I mean, he knew about this debate, your debate, the American debate, had reached the deputy chairman of the council in northern Uganda. So there is a moral dimension, but one of the things I bring out in the book that I think is really important is that humanitarians shouldn't rely only on an argument about a big heart. We should also make a hard-headed argument as well as a big-hearted argument. And I think that the strategic argument for exercising responsibility by the West, and we can come back to what the West means, I'm not ashamed to talk about the West, but my argument is that there are historic reasons as well as strategic reasons and national security reasons for believing that tackling the refugee crisis is in our interest, not just the right thing to do. It's a smart thing to do, not just the right thing to do. The historic argument is if we trash our own history by trashing the rights of refugees, then we actually trash our own history in a way that's dangerous for our own standing. There's a strategic argument, which is that in the modern world, in the global village, if someone else's house is on fire, then your house is on fire. And I live and work in New York, IRC's headquartered in New York, but if you're a European, you know that the Syrian refugee crisis didn't stay in Syria and didn't stay in the Middle East. It washed up on Europe's shores. But there's also a national security argument. There's nothing more powerful for the recruiting sergeants of ISIS, of Daesh, than to be told that the US hasn't got the back of oppressed Muslims around the world. It's just a direct recruiting sergeant. And it's shocking but true that the ISIS Daesh social media channels literally were celebrating when President Trump put out his executive orders stopping refugees coming to the US. So there is a ideological national security argument. And it's true that ISIS Daesh have been vanquished in Raqqa, where we've got operations inside Syria. They've been vanquished in parts of Iraq. Al-Qaeda in some ways is on the back foot, but this is a generational ideological challenge, not just a short-term military challenge. So I think there are strategic arguments as well as moral arguments for dealing with the crisis. Third point, you might agree that it's a big crisis, you might agree that we should do something, but then think, well, there's nothing that can be done because the problem's so big that we can't solve it. And my case to you is that there are things that can be done, but we have to change the way the humanitarian sector works in very fundamental ways if we're to do justice to the length of displacement, the child-focused nature of the displacement. I am very clear that unless we reframe our approach to humanitarian endeavor, we will fail. And the reframing is fundamentally about taking on the fiction that the refugee crisis is a short-term crisis. The fiction is helpful for hosting countries. I don't want to name names, but Uganda, Jordan, etc. It's quite convenient that they can say, look, these people are just here for a short time, we need to provide some shelter for our brothers and sisters in the short term. But the truth is that the large majority of refugees are going to stay. Less than 1% of the world's refugees went home last year. But the fiction is also convenient for the West, because it allows them to say, we'll just give you short-term grants to keep these people alive. And essentially, we as a large NGO, we're a $750 million organization now, the IRC, we are trying to tackle long-term problems of violence against women, poverty and unemployment, ill health, with short-term grants, which is crazy. So it's changing that mindset. What does that mean? I think 4 things are really important to change the mindset. 1, we should be saying that the expectation is that adult refugees are able to work. If you're displaced for an average of 10 years, you need to be able to work. That is only going to be possible if countries like Jordan that are supporting hosting refugees are given massive economic support. Jordan is pegged to the dollar. Jordan has an IMF program. Jordan has debt that's gone up from 54% to 96% of national income. And they've got 650,000 registered refugees. So they need a different kind of offer from the World Bank, the IMF, the international aid donors. At the moment, they're on short-term drip feed of aid. And they say, well, hang on, the King of Jordan can say, I've got a 33% youth unemployment problem among the Jordanians. So if I'm going to let refugees work, I need to ensure that my own population gets properly helped. Now, of course, truth is, if you say refugees aren't allowed to work, that just means they don't work officially. They work in the informal sector, which drives them underground, which has its own problems. So actually, there's a safety benefit, a protection benefit, as well as an economic benefit from regularizing that. They become taxpayers. So there's an employment challenge. We can say more about that. Secondly, the saddest statistic that I've discovered in the last 4 years is that half of all the refugees are children, and less than 2% of the humanitarian budget goes on education. Less than 2%. It's a total scandal. It's also incredibly stupid if you think about it. There are 250,000 Syrians in Lebanon who've never had any education since they left Syria. It's not just a moral scandal, it's strategic stupidity. So we have to take on the idea that education is a luxury, not a lifeline. The first thing that parents will say to you after they check that they tell their relatives that they're alive when they land in Europe is, where can I get education for my kids? Third aspect of this is maybe a bit surprising. I mean, it's obvious if you think about it. What is the thing that refugees lack the most? Cash, money. If you're a Syrian refugee, you don't have access to your Syrian bank account when you leave. The basic idea that since refugees are living in urban areas, they need to pay rent, they need to buy food, the best thing you can give them is not food parcels, the best thing you can give them is cash. Not necessarily literally wads of dollars, but you can do it electronically, you can do it safely. It's a very powerful way of empowering refugees. It's also a powerful way of bringing economic benefit to a local community for hosting refugees, because they are paying rent, they are in the shops. And the fourth element of this, and the final element, is we have to win the argument that welcoming a small number of refugees to our own shores is a symbolic and substantive contribution to the fight against the refugee crisis. And it is, I can say this because I'm not an American, I observe your politics, it's a tragedy, a real tragedy, that the country that has the most successful refugee resettlement program, a bipartisan program for the last 30 years, welcoming about 90,000 refugees a year to the US, 90,000 out of the 25 million. So we're not talking big numbers, not big compared to Uganda. It's a tragedy that program should be being strangled, frankly. The administration said that they were going to put a cap of 45,000 rather than 90,000. Actually, the figures that we published last week show you, it's your country, you're going to end up with a maximum of 15,000 refugees coming this year. It's a complete scandal. Effectively, refugee resettlement, which means meeting the family at the airport, getting their kids into school, getting the adults into work, teaching them English, giving them a car loan. We published a paper on this, that the car loan repayment rates among refugee families are higher than for American families. So the 98% of the car loans get paid back compared to 88% of car loans for a control group. It's a tragedy that program is being strangled. And it is being strangled. We run 26 offices around the US, including in West 33rd Street here in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And it's slowing to a trickle, the number of people who are being allowed in. And people often say to me, well, yeah, it'd be cheaper though, let's keep helping the refugees in Jordan. Why should we bother to have them come here? And the answer to that is, one, for some of the most vulnerable refugees, actually a new start in life is what they need. Two, it's a symbolic stand with countries like Jordan, because it's one thing for the King of Jordan to say, yeah, America's given me money, and then someone says to him, yeah, but the Americans are refusing to take any refugees. If he can say, well, no, actually they are stepping up, and Europe's stepping up, and others are playing their role. And thirdly, as I'm sure there's family stories in this room, it's actually good for the country. I mean, the refugees become productive and patriotic citizens because they know the price of living in a country that doesn't give them the freedom to think as they want and develop as they want. So my point in rehearsing those four aspects is to say the argument that this crisis is unmanageable is actually not true. That's just not just a counsel of despair, it's just it's fake news. And the truth is that it is manageable if we do some basic things in a more sensible and focused way. Just let me finish up by saying, well, what can you all do other than buy my book? The first is that your voice matters, I think. One of my reflections is that we haven't made the argument convincingly enough, and it's almost like we would say in Europe, acquis. It's become accepted that, oh yeah, we let some refugees come in. And so the program is sound, but it's not properly understood. And my warning is you won't have a refugee resettlement program unless you argue for it. And it needs to be argued for with congressmen, with senators, congress people. Your voice matters. Secondly, there are refugees who've arrived and are still arriving, and they need to be buddies with your grandchildren. They need explanation for how the system works. They need some English language teaching. They need to be invited to your house for dinner. The Airbnb are running this thing with us where their hosts are invited to organize a dinner where they invite a refugee family. I am not an Airbnb host, but the reason I wanted, since I run the IRC, we wanted to invite a family. So a family from Bhutan came and had dinner with us. And in the end, the conversation was about their 15, 16-year-old kid and what advice could we give them about how he made school choices that would help him in the future. And they hadn't been able to have that conversation with someone. So there's the human touch really matters. If you're an employer, give refugees a chance to get a job with your business, because they need a chance to make a success of their own lives. You don't have to guarantee them a job, but give them a chance to get a job. And obviously, we want you to be supporters of the IRC as well. One of the reasons I took the job was that I thought IRC was not well enough known, even in its own home turf. It's a great New York institution. It was founded by Einstein here in 1933. It does embody some of the most precious values of New York. It speaks to the history of the city in a profound way, and we're now probably the largest NGO in New York, not including the universities and the hospitals, obviously. But we would like you to become supporters. Some of you already are, I should say, but we'd like those of you who are not to become supporters of the organization, because it's a real jewel in the work that it does, and it can make an argument that is fundamental to the future of the country. So thank you very much for listening, and very happy to have your questions.
Is there a future in convincing European publics that accepting immigrants is advantageous to their societies, fills their labor forces, which otherwise would not be filled? I'm speaking because of the allure that politicians who are nativist politicians, who are anti-immigrant politicians, seem to have in places like Germany, the Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, even Austria now.
Here's the point. First of all, immigration is different from refugees, so let's just clock that. I will answer your question about the immigration thing there, but just to clock for everyone, we're talking about immigrants here, not refugees, who do have different rights than refugees. If you're a refugee, you have a right not to be sent home. If you're an immigrant, you don't have a right not to be sent home. Because in the case of a refugee, it's not safe to be sent home. In the case of an immigrant, if you're from, I don't know, former Yugoslavia, you can't say it's not safe for you to go back to Bosnia or Serbia, unless there's some particular thing of your individual case. Now, here's the real thing, though, which if I was if I really had the answer, I'd probably still be in politics. But the real paradox of this is that countries and communities that have the most immigrants are the happiest about it. The greatest backlash against immigrants is in communities, cities, towns and villages, and countries that have the fewest immigrants. I mean, the Hungarian tragedy is an example of this, but so is the UK situation. The most integrated, diverse communities are the happiest about it. It's true here as well. The biggest backlash against refugees is the places that have hardly any refugees. So that's what makes me think that this is a manageable case. If it was the other way around, for the sake of argument, say it was the case that people who didn't have immigrants in their community really loved them, but those communities that did have lots of immigrants hated them. That would be a totally unmanageable political situation. But given that it's the reverse, you've got to believe it's manageable. Now, we also have shown how not to manage it. And clearly the decision that I was in the government, although thank God it wasn't my decision, I was in the education ministry at the time in 2004, we decided that as part of the enlargement of the EU, the A8 countries, the 8 countries that joined the EU in 2008, we, the UK, who were barreling along economically and thought we were invincible, we said, yeah, anyone, sure, Poland, Czech Republic, that's fine to have an open labour market. We had the option of a 7-year transitional period, which would have limited the number of visas that were given. And we said, no, we're not going to do that. And that was clearly a mistake, because we had a study which said 50,000 Poles are going to arrive, and in fact 500,000 arrived. So that speaks to the point about whether it looks like you know what you're doing when you're in government. So that's a long-winded way of saying, I think it's an argument that can be won, but in any case it has to be won. Because the truth is that people are going to move, and the question is whether or not they're moving legally and in a documented way, or illegally and in an undocumented way.
Well, I thank you for a very
Thank you very
stimulating
much.
morning. And the book is available.
Thank you.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.